The Bible is such a constant fixture at the church, a regular part of worship, a regular part of Sunday school classes, that sometimes we forget that it's not written for us. The Bible was written for people in a very different world and a very different culture than our own. And so sometimes things get lost in translation. That may be the case with the parable that we just heard today and the two characters in it, the Pharisee and the tax collector. The parable assumes that we know who these people are, but that may well not be the case. Growing up in the church, I always got the impression that the Pharisees were the bad guys. I mean, even the word Pharisaic means self-righteous and hypocritical. But in reality, the Pharisees were the good religious folks of Jesus' day. They were part of a reform movement that protested against the pomp and rituals and sacrifices of temple worship. They wanted people to get back to the Bible, as it were, to read the scriptures and do what was said to do there. In that sense, they were not so different from the reformers who led the Protestant Reformation, people like Martin Luther or John Calvin. On top of that, the Pharisees invented the rabbinical Judaism that is still with us today. The rabbis over at Temple Yodef Shalom are direct descendants of the Pharisees that we meet in the Gospels. Now, the tax collector, the other character in the parable, may pose a different interpretive problem than that of the Pharisee. With the tax collector, we may not think badly enough of them. Americans are often not thrilled to have to interact with the IRS, but modern tax collectors have little in common with the tax collectors of Jesus' day. The Roman tax system awarded contracts for collecting revenue and provided soldiers to assist in that process. And those who had the contracts were allowed to keep any money in excess of what they had to pay back to Rome. So the people that had these contracts, in essence, were able to engage in a legal shakedown racket. Under the threat of arrest, they brutalized the population, especially those without power and without influence. And they were hated, despised by the people. There's really nothing comparable in our world. No legal profession held in such universal contempt. From a reputation standpoint, they probably fall somewhere between a drug dealer and a child abuser. And so when Jesus tells this parable, those in his audience know right away who the good guy and the bad guy in the story is. The Pharisee is a model citizen, a devout man who practices the faith and walks the walk. He would be someone any church would love to have as a member. He's meticulous about how he lives out his faith. He even tithes. And as someone who knows the inner workings of the church pretty well, I can tell you how rare that is. No church would want the tax collector as a member. Even if he did tithe, the money would be tainted, stolen from other members of the church. And besides, by definition, tax collectors tended to be selfish and greedy. There seems to be little likelihood that they would want to give up any of their ill-gotten gain. Now these two, the tax collector and the Pharisee, go up to the temple to pray. And I imagine that people listening to this parable are running through their minds what kind of thing might transpire here, but they're making assumptions about what may happen, but I can't believe that any of them are ready for the surprise ending that Jesus is about to spring on them. The Pharisee opens his prayer with thanksgiving. He's thankful that he is a good, upstanding member of society, and why shouldn't he be? It's a good thing that he's not crooked, not a thief like the tax collector. Why shouldn't he thank God for a strong faith that keeps him on the straight and narrow, that keeps him as the kind of model citizen that any church would want as a member? And when you are a model citizen and an ideal church member, well, it's hard not to look down on people as disgusting as tax collectors. The tax collector, on the other hand, seems to realize what a sorry excuse for a human being he is. I don't know if he's had some sort of an epiphany and he's thinking about getting out of the racket, or if he just hates himself for what he does but can't think of giving up all of that money. Either way, he has no thanks to offer God, and certainly nothing to brag about. He knows he has no standing before God, and so in a moment of repentance, he throws himself on the mercy of the court. God, be merciful to me, a sinner. I wonder what the audience, Jesus' audience, thinks of this plea. Do they think it's even genuine? And surely he can't get off that easy. But then Jesus says that the tax collector, and not the Pharisee, goes home justified. That is, goes home right in the eyes of God. Really, Jesus? Then Jesus wraps up the parable by saying that all who exalt themselves will be humbled, and all who humble themselves will be exalted. There's a warning here about the dangers of religion. Religion asks us to do the very things that the Pharisee does, to engage in moral living, generously supporting the church, engaging in spiritual practices. But according to Jesus, the temptation to trust in these practices, to trust in our religiosity, can trip us up. The Pharisee starts to think, tries to imagine that all his religious activity impresses God. And he begins to trust in his own religious activity rather than trusting in God. The tax collector, on the other hand, knows he has no standing before God, and he simply throws himself on the mercy of the court. He trusts himself to God's mercy and finds himself rewarded for that trust. You know, we live in a world that encourages us to be more like the Pharisee. We're supposed to do all that we can to pad our resumes and make ourselves look impressive and sell ourselves to others. Students are told to flesh out their profiles by engaging in extracurriculars and community service so that they can impress that admissions committee. We're told over and over that we need to be good enough, that we need to be impressive enough, that we need to do things to get noticed. And such thinking creeps over into the religious realm. People sometimes start to think that they need to be more in order to get in good with God. I need to be more faithful, more prayerful, more knowledgeable, more generous, more adept at spiritual practices. And all of these things are good in their own right, admirable in their own right. But when we begin to trust in them, begin to think that they impress God in some sort of way, then we need to remember the parable of the Pharisee and the tax collector. Jesus gives us a glimpse of God's heart. here in this parable. And we see a couple of divine attributes in what Jesus tells us. The first one is that, well, you know, you really can't impress God. And that makes perfect sense when you think about it. I mean, who of us can hold ourselves up to the example of Jesus? As it says in the scriptures, all of us are, all fall short and have sinned. All fall short of the glory of God. But the second and really important attribute of God in this parable is how much God longs to embrace us. God stands with arms wide open, just waiting for people to fall into those arms. And it doesn't matter whether or not you're good enough. It doesn't matter what you've done or failed to do. God stands ready to embrace any who turn toward God. And when we experience the amazing grace of God's loving embrace, we will want to be more faithful, more prayerful, more knowledgeable, more generous, more adept at spiritual practices. But that will not be to impress God or to impress anyone else. It will be our way of saying thank you with our lives. All praise and glory to the God who comes to us in Jesus and shows us the face and the heart of God. Thanks be to God.